Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Balint, and I'm very pleased to open the inaugural panel of this, what I would promise to be a fascinating conference. The theme of the first panel, as you have it before you, is really to set out the context, to bring Salman Schocken as a figure to life, and to bring the history of the library into focus. I thought since we have three fascinating papers, we'll present each in turn, and then I'll make sure to leave some questions, some time for questions in the end, so that we can have a conversation. Our first speaker is Dr. Thomas Sparr, who worked in the 1980s, from 1986 to 1989, both at the Hebrew University and at the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem. For most of the 90s, he directed the Jüdische Verlag, and thereafter became editor-in-chief at the Siedler Verlag in Berlin. He's been managing director of the Suhrkamp Verlag, where he now serves as editor-at-large. He's the author, most recently, of a fascinating book you should all read if you haven't, The Grunewald in the Orient, the German Jewish Jerusalem. So he's perfectly positioned to open our conference by giving us some opening remarks about Salman Schocken's relationship to both Rechavia and its inhabitants. So without further ado, Dr. Sparr.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege and my pleasure to talk to you. Some introductory remarks, not a real speech or not a real lecture. A bit about the neighborhood where we are here. And, you know, I arrived yesterday at a very rainy and cold evening to Jerusalem, and I went through Rechavia, and it was by chance that I discovered a completely wet, destroyed German book. I should have brought it. I have it in the hotel room as a proof. And it was a German edition, I suppose from the 40s or 30s, probably from the 30s of Cervantes. So you see, until now you find here in Rechavia, or you find here in Jerusalem, traces of a material transfer which is meaning an intellectual transfer. And as we all know from the treasures of the National Library, we do find much more, also unseen, unknown treasures. I'm never getting tired to mention this, and I'm very grateful to Stefan Litt that I discovered some. I suppose that I discovered some, but there are still so many to discover for you and further generations of researchers. And let me talk about Salman Schocken and Rechavia. It is not a simple subject. It means to talk about the absence of a present, and even more, the presence of an absent. When I began my research about Rechavia, I was obsessed by the idea that I have to take into account the borders of Rechavia. I shouldn't write about somebody in Talbieh or in Talpiot, like Agnon. That doesn't work. It would mean to enlarge Rechavia, and I'm not in the position to enlarge it. I have to keep the borders. And it was only later that I thought this is a real stupid idea to have this fixed idea of Rechavia. And now I think, but now it's in a certain way it's too late, that Rechavia was everywhere where people thought that Rechavia is, and that might have been in Talbieh, in Bet HaKerem, and in other places in the town. And it was just during the last days that I read again Amos Oz's so important and fascinating book, the story of Love and Darkness, and I tried to figure out if probably Salman Schocken would be there. So probably he's also there as a figure connected to Agnon and to the history of Tapiot, of this house, of Joseph Klausner, of the whole family of Amos Oz, him too. He belonged, and as those who have read the book know, that he was longing for Rechavia. He was born in Kerem Avraham, another shchuna, another neighborhood, not far away from here, but it was not the place for Rechavia. Rechavia was really this greater world of those who were in the position of a professorship, belonged to the Hebrew University, or working at the Jewish agency, those who were more established, not the librarians or the other employees who were not belonging to Rechavia. I'm talking about the absence of a present, and even more the presence of an absent. Let me try to describe some relations along the neighborhood where we are hosting or hosted today. And you know, this is exactly at the border of Rechavia and Talbieh, still belonging to Rechavia, but the next house is already Talbieh, so this is also a symbolical border. This was the neighborhood where Salman Schocken arrived at the end of 1933. Rechavia was the new quarter created only 12 years before by Richard Kaufmann and Lotte Kohn. In the early 30s, it was still under construction, emerging, in some parts built up, but still in some parts a wasteland. And there is a famous model which you find about the Schocken Library, but a model, it's, the architect Erich Mendelsohn is writing 36, and I may quote in German. I hope that you understand the quotations probably in German. Gestern bei Schocken: Die Bibliothek ist im Rohbau fertig, sehr gut, Räume innen herrlich, außen schlicht und feierlich, Haus zum ersten Stock im Rohbau herrlich, steht schon 1000 Jahre so. Frau Schocken sagt zu ihm, zu Mendelsohn: Als wir heute Sabbatvormittag gemeinsam die Bauten besuchen, da gibt es wirklich nichts zu meckern. And this is a very Berliner quotation. If you don't have to meckern, it means that you don't have any objections against the construction of this house. The history of German Jews has many places, yet it has, as I see it, one center, and this is Rechavia, the garden city in Western Jerusalem, where Jews from Germany settled especially after 1933, but also before, and Richard Kaufmann developed this neighborhood as a garden city in the early 20s, and it was a typical idea of which he brought from Europe, from Central Europe, from England, and also from Germany, created for other contexts, but a very European context. Rechavia has always been mentioned but less understood as an ensemble by its inner magnetism. I think it is still a subject to be fulfilled to understand how did it come that German Jewish immigrants immigrated especially to Rechavia. There had been other places, and I don't know, have to mention it here so much, but the Carmel in Haifa, some neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, or especially one neighborhood in Tel Aviv, but it was not created as a neighborhood itself, let's say as a little town in itself, with certain borders. And I think it was an inner magnetism, and I would describe it by the intellectual way of behavior, of keeping traditions, of building up houses, furniture, collecting books, hosting people, eating and drinking. And all these aspects are so concentrated here in Rechavia, and I don't find any other place. Unfortunately, until today, we don't have a collective history of the German Jewish immigration to Israel and to Palestine, which is a deplorable lack of research until today. But I think one day it will become two, and then we will see also the significance, or maybe the significance of Rechavia. Let me tell you some aspect which is connected to Schocken too. Until now, it's not researched, or it was not researched, how many flowers were imported from Germany. Which flowers? How were the gardens constructed? How did behavior the gardeners? What were the arrangements? We know much more about books and about letters, but we know less about this very central aspect of flowers. And we can do some research, and I will quote something later by Else Lasker-Schüler. Else Lasker-Schüler was obsessed by details. She was obsessed by the cafes and restaurants, by the whole neighborhood. Therefore, she is an important, enormously important source for the history of Rechavia, because she was so engaged in the daily life, and then she wrote it down, not in diaries. She didn't have a diary, but she wrote it down in letters, which she sent. And as you know, there is a very, very important relation to Schocken. She wrote to Schocken in the later 30s. She had been here 3 times, 33 and 35 and 38. She prepared her 3rd trip. She arrived in spring 39, and as you all know, it was forbidden for her to come back to Zurich. And from Zurich, she's writing in November 1933, a Friday evening, to Salman Schocken, and I may quote again to just let you know and show you this very specific relation which she held to Salman Schocken. Hoch zu verehrender Adon Schocken, ich bin die Else Lasker-Schüler, a letter of presentation, und ich habe schon alle Formalitäten von hier, auch die Kaution nach Jerusalem zu reisen. Mir fehlt nur noch das britische Visum von Palästina. Wenn die Erlaubnis des britischen Konsulats an dies britische hiesige Konsulat gesandt wird, kann ich fahren. Ich warte und warte nun. Alle in unserer frommen, lieben Stadt sagten, Sie, Adon, haben großes Ansehen. Adon Agnon, der wundervolle Dichter und Mensch, hat Sie furchtbar gern, und nun erlaube ich mir, Sie zu bitten, Adon, Mr. Rainer, falls er noch am Buchabteil des britischen Konsulats oder Generalkonsulats selbst, um das Visum für mich, der Dichterin Else Lasker-Schüler, zu befürworten. Ich würde ja als Touristin nach Jerusalem kommen, 4 Monate bleiben. Ich habe mich geschämt und schäme mich, nicht auch im Leid in Jerusalem zu sein. Und ich fürchte, es ist des Höchsten, und ich fühle, es ist des Höchsten Wille, und ich fürchte mich nicht. Und was geschehen soll, ferner mit mir geschehe. So she asked for his engagement and for his subvention, for money, and as you all know, as I hope you know, Salman Schocken was very generous. She supported, and he was one of the very, very rare people. Probably there had been 2 in Jerusalem, Ernst Simon and Salman Schocken, who believed in the importance of Else Schüler's poetry, in the significance of her work, and he gave until her death in January 45 many support. He and another lady, Rivka Kimmel, from the Jewish Agency, who was also very engaged about all what Else Schüler was writing, was publishing, and she couldn't go back to Zurich as she wished it in the summer of 39, because the Swiss authorities blocked the remigration, and she had to live here, and she lived very much in trouble, and she was really the inhabitant of Rechavia who described this neighborhood, and one day I think we should really publish the correspondence between Salman Schocken and Else Schüler. Let me just quote one more letter to Salman Schocken from July 1940, from after a visit. Adon, ich bin jetzt bald im Manuskript Tiberias bei den Gärten angelangt. 3 Gärten außer Gethsemane sah ich, die mir so gefielen. Dr. Tichos indischer Garten, die Dschungeln von Ollendorfs, Mendelsohns Blumenfelder, from Erich Mendelsohn, not far away from here, at the windmill, und der große Feigenbaum, also there, und ihr Garten und liebevollen Gewerrets Garten sah ich noch nicht. Geweret Athena Luisa Mendelsohn sagte, ihr Adon habe ihn angelegt. Nun soll ich Ihren Garten doch sehen, ich kann ja nicht nur fantasieren, und da frage ich morgen im Telefon, kann mir vielleicht eine Hausangestellte ihn zeigen? Pflücken werde ich nicht und darf Betreffende nicht. Nie werde ich eine Blume aus ihrer Welt im Weine Blumen abpflücken. Sie ist ja auch ein Mensch, ihre Dichterin Else Schüler, Adon, Prinz Yusuf. And here you see, then she's going to the garden. She's describing almost each flower, each sort of flowers which she could find there. And it's a kind of contribution to the history of the immigration, which we until do not have. And it's connected to Salman Schocken, and therefore just let me hint just to the flowers for the beginning, and then to another relationship which was quite important for Salman Schocken. This is the relation with Gershom Scholem. As you know, they met in the time of the First World War in Berlin, and Schocken was probably one of the rare people to whom Scholem wrote during the period of pre-immigration and after the immigration. He wrote when he departed from Berlin in September 23, and he's describing his way via Trieste to Jerusalem. He is describing the projects, he is describing the library which he could take as a whole, which was a certain miracle for such a young man to take already the whole collection. And Salman Schocken was especially interested, and we will hear Noam will talk about the two different collections, which then there are certain, and therefore I'm very curious, there are certain relations between these collections, but it was Scholem who tried to engage Schocken to take part in this immigration of his books, in the building up of the library, and from step to step, during the years from 23 to 33, when Schocken still lived in Germany and Scholem had been already here, there was an exchange of projects, and some of those, let's say, some of those projects of Salman Schocken are, I'm almost sure that they are due to the Scholem's influence. And as you know, Scholem wrote in 38 the 10 thesis of the Kabbalah, ahistorical sentences of the Kabbalah, and these he sent as a letter to Schocken, and that was a gesture of thankfulness, but it was also a plaidoyer of reflection, an act of reflection, and of trying to engage Schocken more for this idea of the research of the Kabbalah. And as you know, Schocken agreed. Schocken was engaged in the research of Hebrew poetry, but especially of the Kabbalah. And it is very interesting to discover in the letters of Scholem, in Scholem's letters, especially at the 40s, that Scholem also tried to engage Schocken for the support of Walter Benjamin. He wanted him to publish books, to support in the 30s an immigration, later immigration of Walter Benjamin to Jerusalem. And as far as I understood, Salman Schocken kept some reluctance due to the fact that Walter Benjamin got already support from Leo Magnus in the late 20s to come to Jerusalem. He got a scholarship, he tried to learn Hebrew, and he began to learn Hebrew, but he never arrived. And so I think we have to understand Salman Schocken's reluctance due to the fact that Benjamin, in a certain way, disagreed to come to Palestine, to come to Jerusalem. He didn't even come as a visitor. And that was an engagement which didn't succeed, but later it changed in the Schocken's publishing house in the United States. It's another story and history of this very complex and complicated relation between Schocken and Scholem. I'm almost sure that it was not only the relation of a researcher and the supporter, but that Schocken took an active part in consenting, in correcting, and in contributing this research, not only as an institution, but as a vivid research until today. What is still will be what I should do and will do is to find out the daily life relations during the 30s and 40s in the relation between Schocken and Scholem. As a Lasker Schüler, we have a very, very intense and vivid picture of this relation. The relations between the Jewish institutions here in Jerusalem and Salman Schocken. I think we will very much learn by Stefanie Mahrer's forthcoming book about Schocken's universe, and as far as I understood, she's proving that it's a whole cosmos, and she created the very fruitful concept of a transnational existence. And it's a very modern concept. So Salman Schocken was, as we said, one of ours by this traveling and retraveling immigrating and re-remigrating, by this living in two places at the same time. And as I told you, Salman Schocken and Rechavia means the absence of a present, and the presence of an absent, which means he was here and he was not here. He was on the border of Rechavia and Talbieh. He was in a villa which belonged much more to Balint than to Rechavia. As you know, Rechavia was a modest concept in the houses. It was not that villa, but the villa was really the Grunewald which we found there. And, but this is a set of contradictions which makes it so interesting to see all these aspects and to do further research, which should be still done, as I think, and therefore I'm very grateful to be here and to learn so much from the other contributions. Thank you so much for your attention.